I'm surprised that Britain doesn't have a MacArthur Award, actually, but certainly lots of people in this room who probably deserve one. But anyway, I am very excited to be here, and one of the reasons why honestly, where I'm in front of rooms like this, I traveled all the way across the pond to be here, and it's because, statistically speaking, someone like me should not be here, period. And when I grew up in the South Bronx, most of the people, it was literally the epicenter, the poster child for urban blight. And if you were from that area, most folks, whether in the media or even folks that lived, on the other side of town, would often think that people who lived there were either pimps or pushers or prostitutes. And teenage pregnancy was epidemic. And it took I am just grateful, for the parents that I had, that I actually am here. But one of the important things about what I want to show you today is that it is about the evolution of a community. But the way I like to tell the story is actually through the development of my own family, like where they came from and where they decided to go. So this is my parents. They moved to the Hunts Point section of the South Bronx in the late 1940s, and they were part of the Great American Migration. This is when blacks moved up from the American South up north in search of a better life. And they moved to a community that was mostly a white working class community, very much like some areas in London that were actually walk to work neighborhoods, where you had literally neighborhoods that had a residential area in one place and an industrial area right next door, so you can walk to work from there. But many other folks, like my parents from down south, and also folks from the Caribbean, starting with Puerto Ricans, also came up in search of a great American dream. And the real estate industry developed something called white flight. Because it wasn't just that poor blacks and Latinos moved into a community and suddenly the real estate prices went down. That was actually a real structured piece within the real estate industry, where they would say things to the white families, blacks are coming, your property values are going to go down. And that would be to get them to sell their homes really cheaply. And then blacks would come in and they'd want to buy a place because this was where, it seemed like, the personification of all that they wanted in their lives, and they would buy the house for much more than it was worth. So it was a really kind of crappy way of doing business, but it happened. Add to that, around the time, highways became king in America, just kind of like here. Our version, the person who was most responsible for that in New York State was a guy named Robert Moses, who decided that, we needed to rebuild all the infrastructure, in New York State to service the needs of cars. And unfortunately, the South Bronx, and people who had them actually, so the South Bronx, had the, very unfortunate distinction of being located right between the wealthy county of Westchester to the north and Manhattan to the south. So we actually lost about 500,000 people during that time when Robert Moses decided that we needed to create highways right through the heart of the South Bronx. And this is a picture of one of the main highways that goes through. This is called the Cross Bronx, and it was in the middle of construction. And I show this picture because it really does show you that, even in mid-construction, that underneath where that expressway is right now, there were thriving communities. It separated a community from itself. And many residents were often given less than a month's notice before they were told they had to find someplace else to live. Add to that, another term that was created, actually this time by the banking industry, bank presidents and their teams literally got together and with red China markers, drew circles around areas where they were no longer going to make any kind of investments at all. So when I think about my family's property, what they bought in 1947 or so wasn't really worth much, back in around the time that, say, I was born. And this is me in a very early networking opportunity. But this is what I grew up with. If landowners and property owners couldn't really make investments in their property, oftentimes, especially those that owned larger tenement buildings like that, found it much more profitable to actually have their building torched, commit arson, rather than to try to make investments in buildings that they knew wasn't going to pay. So that insurance money was a payoff for them. But yeah, these were, in many cases, these are all pictures of the neighborhood that I grew up with, and in many cases they were the playgrounds, the only ones that we had, because it was also around the time of budget cuts in schools, and things like playgrounds were literally, and musical instruments were literally being taken out because they didn't have teachers to fund things like that. And it kind of reminds me very, very much of a war zone. And it was, in a lot of cases. My brother had actually served 2 separate tours in Vietnam, only to be gunned down in some kind of drug war, a neighborhood over from mine. So it really didn't occur to me that much could change, in my neighborhood at all. And I actually left the neighborhood to go to college, with absolutely no desire to ever return. And this is actually what is in our community right now. But all those kinds of, the historical, issues around my community, it led to the environmental abuses that we actually have today. And I'd like to think that, if you think about it, and here we have an extremely poor community. But just imagine, and so it was a really politically expedient place to put all of these kind of environmental burdens. But just imagine, if, mostly because affluent people didn't want to have to see them, and they had the political will to make sure that didn't happen. But when I imagine that if we had actually located our power plants, our waste facilities, our diesel truck routes, chemical facilities, et cetera, if we located them in rich communities just as easily as we did in poor ones, I would think that we would have had a clean and green economy a long, long time ago. So the kind of environmentalism that I do is called environmental justice. And very simply, it means that no community should have to bear the brunt of lots of environmental burdens and not enjoy environmental benefits. And unfortunately, right now, race and class are unbelievably reliable indicators. Is where you're going to find the good things like parks and trees, and where you're going to find the bad things like waste facilities and power plants. And other parts of the country, they find things like mega hog farms and really gross things like that. But there, in addition to those burdens, clearly some of those things you saw before just aren't pleasant to be around, but it's not just that. They have some pretty severe health consequences as well. We have one of the country's highest asthma rates, childhood asthma rates in particular, in the South Bronx. We also have an enormous amount of obesity, and diabetes follows suit as well. Type 2 diabetes in particular, the kind that most people didn't get until they were in their late 30s and early 40s. We're seeing it in kids as young as 3 years old, partially because of the food desert that we have in our community. Access to healthy and affordable produce in our communities is extremely hard to come by. But add to that the fact that parents really aren't all that interested in letting their kids go out to play and get some physical exercise if they feel that that their kids are going to get hit by a diesel truck, or that the air really smells bad because of some of the other facilities. In addition to that, Columbia University did a study back in 2006 that gave absolute proof that being in proximity, close proximity to fossil fuel emissions actually causes learning disabilities in our young kids. And I think we know now that kids that don't do well in school are much more likely candidates for jail rather than higher education or great jobs. And I think it's just, when you think about it, somehow or another, all the facilities that you saw before, garbage in and of itself became a great kind of growth industry. And that actually is what got me started in this work. When I moved back home to my community, after running away for a really long time, I only moved back because I was broken starting graduate school, and my parents let me stay in my own room. But moving back there was not what I wanted to do, but what it did do was help politicize me in a way that I never thought I would be. At the time, our mayor, Giuliani, and America's mayor before 9/11, and our governor, Pataki, had decided that they were going to create a huge waste facility on our waterfront. And this would have brought about 40% of the city's municipal waste to our community. We were already handling 40% of the city's commercial waste. And it was just like an extraordinary burden. And it was only through that discovery that I realized, like, wait a second, our community isn't just dirty because people in our community don't care, which is kind of the feeling that many of us had. And that's why so many of us, if we got a little bit of education, we had a huge brain drain. So it wasn't like there weren't really brilliant, smart people in my community. If they were able to, they left. And I know that there are many, places in the city of London where you get that too. So brain drains, really something critical to really be thinking about. And we thought that, my goodness, I just saw the way regulations are used to discriminate against poor people and poor people of color. And the fact that I was living there just made me want to be as much a part of the solution as anything else in my life at the time. But I gotta tell you, so fighting against that waste facility was an enormous, victory for us because we won. But at the same time, it became clear to me that what I didn't want to spend all my life doing, and what I didn't think our community needed to be doing, was only fighting against something. We needed to be fighting for something. And then there were like these really interesting kind of community visioning processes, where folks, actually gave themselves permission to dream about what they wanted in their own neighborhoods. Things like clean air, or living wage jobs that didn't sacrifice their health or the environment, or a waterfront park in their own community so they didn't have to travel so far to get to something like that. And these are like little, you would think, they're basic kind of wants and desires for people, right? But it wasn't, to some extent, not in a place like the South Bronx. But my real reason for doing the work that I do now is actually this puppy. Because around the time we were fighting against this waste facility, I kept getting these crazy notices. I thought they were crazy at the time, because it was essentially a seed grant program saying if you wanted to do some work, some regeneration work around the Bronx River, then apply for one of these small, $10,000 seed grants. And I was like, look, that's really lovely and all, but you can't get to the Bronx River from our community because there's all these facilities running around, on our waterfront. So I paid it absolutely no attention. And if it were not for this dog, taking me and literally, she's like 85 pounds, pulling me into what I thought was the nastiest illegal garbage dump in our community. And it was, but fortunately, with the help of her, we realized that it dead-ended at the Bronx River. And so with a bunch of other community folks, and I didn't know who not to ask for help. I looked for help from the government, I looked for help from local businesses, and otherwise, we were actually able to leverage that $10,000 over many years into a $3 million park. And so this is what it looked like back in 2006, and this when it was finally, created. And this is the kind of, it's become such a community amenity, and I really do believe that it helps people in our community, just because it's been so actively used, really think about, beauty in a way that they weren't before, and that this was there for them as well. And I loved it so much. I actually got married there back in 2006, with my lovely dog Xena as my flower girl. I know, she's cute, isn't she? But, in addition to it being a really groovy place for me to actually have my wedding, which it was also really allowed the community to see themselves in a completely different way. And it also helped me think about, what else can we do here? I was responsible for writing a $1.25 million federal transportation grant to design the South Bronx Greenway, which is an 11-mile network of waterfront esplanades and on-street bike paths that are designed to encourage, the development of both transportation as well as physical activity infrastructure, as well as create local opportunities for entrepreneurial development as well. So this is actually the street that leads down to the park. This is what it's going to look like as construction starts later this summer. And this is a really interesting connection, because this little piece of land actually separates us. On the other side of it, it's only 25 feet of water that separates us from this really massive, 400, 600 acre park on the other side of it. But creating just a little pedestrian walkway and a little bridge over it is going to allow us to actually really make a way over there. And this is another kind of abandoned street end. This one actually had a little more access than the one that I originally thought it was. But this is the kind of activity that we're going to be seeing there, pretty soon. And I think it's really important to note that, here we are, and people have asked me this question all the time. So if you're making a, formally destitute community, so attractive? Aren't you going to be displacing people? And the answer is yes, that could happen, which is why, we're arguing both in the South Bronx and New York City, and also I would encourage, the folks here in London to understand is that you've got to start making investments in people right now, so that those that are actually living in the communities where these kind of projects are going to happen actually get a chance to stay with that, and stay with it. And that comes as a result of liberal financing, loans for home ownership, and also local entrepreneurial development as well. Because you want to make sure that people who's had to stick it out through the hardest times in our communities are actually there and actually loving it through because they actually do have made an they have made an investment in it through whether their homes or their local entrepreneurial opportunities. You just don't want to displace them simply because they need to be considered a real active part of the community in that regard. We also, really truly believe that as we work to restore the environment, that a really important part of that lovely ecosystem are human beings, in our communities. So once we realized, as we work to restore the Bronx River, we realized that many of the jobs that were associated with the restoration were actually we were bringing people in to do it, mostly because people in our own communities were not qualified to do that kind of work. So we started a program called BEST, or Bronx Environmental Stewardship Training, to teach folks in our communities skills around environmental remediation and restoration, everything from urban forestry to green roof installation to cleaning up contaminated lands. And we've got this really amazing, amazing program that shows what you can do when you actually invest in people, early on. And many of the people that actually have gone through our program, many of them formerly incarcerated. Most of them have been on, some kind of public assistance, and almost all were unemployed before they came to us. But to see someone who recognizes that they now have a personal and a financial stake in the betterment of their own environment, that's the kind of empowerment that you cannot take away from somebody when they know that they're a part of the solution. And it's something, again, that we need to encourage much more often in the development of these green-collar jobs. And another thing is that, in the States especially, if you've got a job placement rate of 50%, most people are thrilled. Ours is at 85% and actually inching up, which we're really, really proud of. And again, these are people that were taken off the welfare rolls, most of them, people that are taken out of the incarceration system and no longer a drain, on our society, but an active part of it. And also, the work that we do is all about poverty alleviation and environmental remediation at the same exact time. And because we believe that improves cities and other areas while supporting the most vulnerable populations in those areas. The term, or the, the often cited broken windows theory, implemented, actually in some cases really problematically, by Giuliani during his mayoral administration, states that vandalism and other kinds of minor infractions of the law are precursors to larger problems and must be addressed immediately to prevent further disorder. I have a theory that actually augments that, but takes it to a completely different level, and I call it the broken branches theory, which brings to bear studies from major universities, the practical experience of sustainable South Bronx, and other examples that to fix perennial health, social, and environmental and economic problems, if you can do so by training and actually employing local residents to assume professional horticultural infrastructure and stewardship roles. And think about it, poorly maintained or non-existent urban greenery should and will be seen as a potential liability that needs to be regarded as a priority remediation task, just like New York City's broken windows, back in the 90s and 80s. And add to that the fact that environmental services provided by healthy horticultural infrastructure pay great dividends on our investments in terms of the development of new green industries, improved environmental and public health, and also quality of life benefits, everything from stormwater management, air quality improvements, and urban heat island mitigation, where you have a robust horticultural infrastructure which reduces, a city's ambient temperature, and it also helps mitigate global warming as well. And you couple that with the fact that mental health is actually improved by the presence of greenery. The studies that I'm particularly referencing from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, show that stress levels are reduced, crime rates go down, that a community's pride level actually goes up, and self-esteem in girls in particular goes up, and Lord knows we need more of that. And it's just such an inspiring kind of thing to think about, that we can do that, just by working, to create these kind of green jobs in our communities as well. We were actually really lucky to be able to find the funding to hire a couple of the folks that we train to become Greenway stewards, because again, the Greenway is coming, into our neighborhood. We do not have a history, of having parks in our community, so it is a bit of an education process to show people that this is a really important part of their ecosystem, and one that they should really pay attention to and love. So this young man, his name is James Wells, it looks like he's just pruning a tree, but what he's actually doing is something lot more strategic than that. First of all, he had to understand what kind of tree it was, and I don't even know what it is, so I can't even tell you. But I just make the programs, I don't actually do the work. But anyway, what he's doing right now is because he was responding, to community's concerns. Like this tree, one of the few old growth trees in our community, had so many branches so low on it that it actually blocked the street light across the street. And people on that block were complaining about there being a lot of illicit activity happening because the area was so dark. Drugs were sold. I don't exactly remember what was going on there, but people were concerned, about the crime on that one corner. But once, he pruned that tree to let the light in, guess what? It wasn't happening there anymore. So that kind of technique is actually called crime prevention through environmental design. Thank you very much. Did it cost the city anything? Did we have to, add more lighting? No, you just know how to prune a tree so that this can happen. Another thing, again, these guys really get to know the community, and they see what some of the needs are. This tree happened to be in front of a senior citizen center, and I think most of us, with elderly parents or folks in our lives, know that after a while, the elderly suffer from something called social isolation, and they tend to withdraw into themselves unless they're given a reason, to be outdoors. So creating this little opportunity for folks to actually be outside and in their community was actually a really important step toward that. The same, you've all heard of Jane Jacobs and her famous, eyes on the street theory. That in and of itself, when more people are outside, that in and of itself is a crime prevention technique. It makes people feel safer. It makes them feel, happier to be around each other. And little projects like that, I don't think it's a little project, actually. Projects like this actually help people feel like they're more a part of the fabric of a community. We also, we got the $3 million to create the park, we didn't get any kind of money for promoting it or marketing it, so we had to take matters into our own hands, and we did our own trailblazing project, and this was our green line, where we literally painted a green line to show the path to the park from the community. And little kids actually made up little songs about it. You see them skipping along the line, the green line takes you to the park, kind of songs like that. And we were like the Pied Piper, it was the cutest thing ever. And we also created an anti-poop campaign. To help people be mindful about their little animals and stuff. And this is one of my favorite projects. One of the things I've learned actually in Europe was actually discovering what green roofs were. And it was just like, you can plant a roof, and I just thought they were really beautiful, but then, of course, came to find out all about like the many kind of environmental, issues that they addressed, everything from stormwater management to urban heat island effect to energy conservation, because it actually provides like a green layer that cleans the air. Very exciting. And for us, another really important thing was the fact that it provided lots of local jobs that could not be outsourced. What are you going to do? Or same thing with like doing solar installations or building retrofits. Again, you can't take them overseas to do. It has to be done here. So this was the job that we were doing actually on my house back in the Bronx. And we just planted this roof just a few months ago. And this is my upstairs neighbor, who actually happens to be the son of one of our best graduates, who's a great, great woman. And this is the roof that we did on top of our office building back in 2005. And it's just become this really, beautiful kind of, point in the community that folks realize like that these kind of environmental benefits are all sorts of beautiful, fantastic things that we need to see more of. And of course, it also, because when you think about it, this kind of project, these are just huge sewage treatment plants in different parts, of the states. And what they do here is actually, Well, they're big, single-use, ugly, huge energy consumers, and the fact that if you can reduce the amount of stormwater that goes into them, you might be able to reduce the need for some of these. Obviously not completely obliterate the use of them, but horticultural infrastructure can actually pay some huge benefits as well, and provide lots of local jobs for the communities as well. And just imagine, if 20% of all New York City is rooftops. But just imagine if we were able to create this level, of greenery in our community, that we would, birds on their way flying south for the winter would actually kind of be, they'd stop for a while thinking it was a sanctuary. Like, all right. Now they just zoom past us, like, let's get out of here. But it could change. But another thing we're doing is and actually, we didn't tear down the highway just yet. I wish we did, but we will. This is one of Robert Moses's last projects, and it's just literally just one of the most stupid things. But you can see it doesn't get a whole heck of a lot of use. It's called the Sheridan Expressway, and even the New York Post, which is not this bastion of liberal media, when the State Department of Transportation found out that they were planning on spending $500,000 that'd be like nothing, like $500 million to fix a highway that was only 1.25 miles long, that literally goes absolutely nowhere. Even they called it a boondoggle, okay? And so a bunch of our groups got together to think about what else could we do there? Again, people who had been living, in our communities that had been impacted by this highway, as silly and as tiny as it was, that disconnected us, literally it separates my community in half. It also separates, a good portion of that community from the Bronx River, and from other communities as well. So it was just like, what if this highway wasn't there? Could we create a transportation plan that actually addressed the transportation needs of the region, but also, free up some of that land so that we can actually do something with it? And at 28 acres, it could be one of the largest development projects in all of New York City. And so with that, we set about, did a transportation plan as well as an economic development analysis to see what else could we do on that site. And turns out that we would be able to create this level, of housing, open space, and local retail as well, community and school space, and also local retail. And for me, the fact that removing the Sheridan would create this level of investment, in our community, this number of permanent, I didn't even include the construction, end of the jobs, but permanent jobs for our community. This was incredible. And just to show that we're really not completely insane about any of this, it's been done actually all over the world. In Seoul, South Korea, they actually built the highway over their river and then discovered, oh, maybe we should get rid of that. And fortunately, they did. And this area has become this amazing cultural hub, in Seoul. And, well, closer to me anyway, is Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where the city and the town council and the mayor decided, do we really kind of need that place? And discovered that if they spent more money on the revitalization of the area, got rid of the highway, they'd actually make more money, more profits this way. And the same thing, in our community. Again, we know we're experts, in the development and planning of our community. We simply want to be treated that way. And so and add to the fact that we were already working as happily as we were on the restoration of the Bronx River, it made perfect sense for us to think about how we can, take away, this old vestige, of an antiquated highway system that never should have been built in the first place, and create something that would actually meet our needs. Oh, another really lovely thing is something called, we created, well, we didn't create it. It's a partnership between Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Sustainable South Bronx, called the Fab Lab, and it stands for Fabrication Laboratories. And I got first connected with the Fab Labs when I saw projects actually happening in Ghana, where they were, what it is, I should probably say what that is. So it's essentially like computers hooked up with, some really specific open source design software and fabrication machines so that you can pretty much create almost anything you want. And so in Ghana, they were actually creating things like solar collectors, so that, in places that had no hope of being on the grid at all, they'd create these solar collectors so that folks could actually have a couple extra hours, of electric, some light at the end of the day, so that kids could actually get, some studying in, so that small businesses could flourish a little, things like that. In the South Bronx, we actually have one as well, and so we're doing a whole bunch of educational programs around it. We're starting with little kids, so they can actually see how, you do paper cutout snowflakes, so that they can see what it actually looks like when they create a design, load it up into a computer, actually using Google SketchUp, and then, run it through one of these fabrication machines. So at the end of the day, they actually have something that they've created and take it home, and it's, it actually lasts a lot longer than they thought. And again, it was their own personal creation. They were thinking about how do we, create opportunities for the personal creator and designer in all of us. And so there's all sorts of other, projects, everything from, laser cutting, the tops of, Macintosh computers, et cetera, and stuff like that, to, doing like three-dimensional, workups on anything. A big, huge part of what we want to do is think about how we can use recycled materials as raw materials. So creating like opportunities for the development of small lot manufacturing and furniture making, and working with designers to do that. And we also created a program called the Fab Lab Design Fellows, so that folks from the do-it-yourself and make communities in New York City, actually, because they want to use all this equipment, but in exchange for that, they actually have to teach a class for us, teaching kids or whatever, so that they can do this. And so these guys are actually making stuff that I don't even fully understand what it is they're doing, but I do love the fact that they can literally, take a design, from their head and turn it into something that they want to see. And really, like, I'm sure this probably makes sense to, to some of you all, but it's just the kind of thing that really excites me to think that, we're really like creating fertile ground for inventors of the future, and they're coming right from our community as well. And right now, it's all located in a NASCAR trailer, and we're looking for funding to actually move it into our new spaces, which will be like a palatial, Fab Lab with a Fab Cafe and all sorts of Fab people. It'll be fabulous. Okay, pop quiz time, shall we? America, 5% of the world's population, 25% of its what? You're all right, but I heard pollution, greenhouse gases, a whole bunch of other things like that, of that nature. And that's right, but that's not what I'm interested in right now. So, gee, why is she talking about prisons? Is this an environmental lecture? Yes, somewhere along the lines in American, culture and economies, prisons became really great business. So remember this cute little guy, right? And the fact that, now we know that proximity to fossil fuel emissions actually cause learning disabilities and growing young minds. That is absolutely true. And so remember, garbage and prisons, actually two of our largest growth industries. And but building, coal plants in China, also, when you think about it, they are linked. The fact that so many, of our manufacturing jobs are actually exported, overseas, in particular to China, outsourced there. And we know the high cost to the environment that building two burning coal-fired power plants each and every week does to the environment. Many of us do not think about what that, what the loss of manufacturing jobs actually means to the guy on the block, in poor communities where a manufacturing base was the difference between people actually having, it was often their entry into the middle class and keeping them there, as opposed to it being, just, or people like going into the kind of illicit activity that we see happening. And we know that, pollution and poverty is in the States, and especially in larger urban areas, we find that it is poverty that often leads people, to a lot of illicit activity, because many of the offenses are not like huge violent offenses. Like if there's, and you'll find that many people are not making huge amounts of money, selling drugs. They're just not. And I do believe that if people had more access to decent jobs, in particular green jobs, we would also have less people going to jail. Because honestly, think about the fact that both prisons and pollution, they fuel a pollution-based economy that punishes most the people who did the least to produce it. And it also fuels a prison economy that none of us can even be proud of. So to that end, one of the things that we did back in our community was create some kind of projects that could show that you can actually alleviate poverty and remediate the environment at the same time. One of those projects was the Eco-Industrial Center, and it's a collection of businesses that use recycled materials as raw materials. My community is really an epicenter for many of the recycling-based recyclers and recycled facilities in our community. And so what we wanted to do was create a collection of businesses that use recycled materials as their raw materials, and also do it on a site that has both barge and rail access, so you can use those kinds of less polluting sources for transport instead of just a truck-based, diesel-based system, as well as, the bottom line is much of these things, or bottom line is all of this stuff is already here. So we wanted to create opportunities that would allow much of it to be reused, creatively reused, and turned into the kind of value-added products that actually have a real market. So we're mitigating solid waste and creating the kind of jobs that our community desperately needs. We're one of the poorest congressional districts in all of the United States. In New York City, one of the richest cities in the world, and this is what we have, a couple miles away from the financial district. And so creating these jobs was not just like this little thing that we wanted to do. I mean, this was the difference between community, our people in our community actually developed the kind of lives that they wanted to lead or not. However, my lovely city decided that on that same site, what they thought would actually make a really great amount of sense was building a 2,000-bed jail on that same site. And under the guise of, well, so many people from the South Bronx, actually end up in the criminal justice system, we want to make it easier for their families to actually get to go see them. How about you make it easier for them not to go there in the first place? By giving them a job, by helping them be a productive member of society, by giving the kind of green jobs that actually can support our quality of life and remediate the environment at the same time. Wow. So that was a really kind of difficult place for us to be, I gotta tell you. Oh, and especially since my dear city had also, like so many cities around the country and around the world, creating sustainability plans, and ours is called Plan NYC, and I was like, well, maybe they think that those 2,000 beds, are actually like part of their affordable housing strategy, since they expect us there any old way. Not so sure. But anyway, the whole idea, for someone like us and for reasonable people who want to see the best for everybody, I actually co-founded an organization with Van Jones, who's like kind of my compatriot over in the West Coast. And Green for All really stresses that it means that you can get multiple benefits from the same exact dollar if we coordinate the life of that dollar with policies and practices that help it go exactly where it's needed. And so Green for All is a national campaign that actually seeks to use the green economy to move people out of poverty, that has both a top-down approach as well as a grassroots one. In last year's energy bill, which was basically a love song to the oil and coal industry, there buried in it was actually $125 million for green job training programs. It hasn't been appropriated just yet, but we're working on that right now. But the point is, like, even in the midst of all that, the fact that there was $125 million of importance given to the fact that green jobs and the creation of them could actually be useful for our country was enormous. And then you couple that with the fact that their grassroots efforts are actually happening across the country that support the development, of green-collar job training programs is really, really important. And because we truly believe that all of the solutions that we have to dealing with the climate crisis, environmental remediation, and poverty, they all need to incorporate poverty alleviation through policies that acknowledge the fact that the playing field has never been level, especially when it comes to poor communities and poor communities of color. And then we can mitigate the kind of environmental inequities that poor communities have traditionally experienced. I mean, what America really, truly needs, is a Green New Deal, the kind of government investment on the scale of the Marshall Plan, with the kind of funding and regulations and incentives that make green manufacturing, green businesses and industries, clean tech, et cetera, with green collar jobs actually flourish domestically. And the same way that we fought for our waterfront, as a way to heal some of the wounds that we experienced over the years, is a way, this also, the development of green collar jobs and green industries is also a way to create the kind of healing that we absolutely need to see happening all over our country, and I think all over the world. I think London has everything that it's been waiting for. Like in particular, folks along the places where much of this greenway development, in particular East London Green Grid, is actually happening. And I find it so interesting that making sure that we include, people that are there, because again, they're the kind of experts in their own communities, and they want to be able, and that people need to recognize that they are the assets, the much-needed asset that's going to be needed, that's going to make, this London go over the top in terms of the kind of planning and development that can happen here. And, we're just coming off the 40th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination. He died, just as, or he was killed, just as, even his thinking was evolving, around both, not just moving along, racial equality, but economic equality, and understanding that needed to happen for all people. And, that prophetic speech that he gave the night before when he was looking out on the promised land was incredibly important in so many ways, because I'm sure that as he was looking out on the mountaintop, looking at the promised land, the last thing he saw was 25% of the world's population locked up. He did not see, communities dying and suffering, from the vestiges of toxic industries. What he saw was a future that was green for all of us. And that is the kind of future that I think we all want to be a part of, because I'm sure we are all ridiculously tired, of watching tributes to our collective failures, go up instead of monuments to hope and possibility. So with that, thank you very much.